So this is the 7th year of the Local Foods College, and this program comes from you from the University of Minnesota Extension. Our Northwest Regional Sustainable Development Executive Director, Linda Kingery, is the lead organizer of this event, and we have folks who are collaborating from the University of Minnesota Extension all across the state. We are currently in week 4 of 5 of the session of the Local Foods College. And the really unique thing and that's really neat about this program and this session is that you can view live at home with others or watch the recordings later on from our Regional Sustainable Development Partnership YouTube page, whatever is most convenient for folks to connect with. And using this online format, while there were a little bit of technical difficulties, we are able to work through it, and this helps us reach a wider audience. So why do we do this Local Foods College? The goal is to support small farmers, local food systems, and to support gardeners and those who want to produce food for themselves. We're able to cover a variety of topics with these different sessions. So tonight's plan. There are questions. As you have questions, if they come up, please send them in the chat. Along with anyone else in the location you're tuning in from, are muted currently throughout the session. These sessions, again, will be recorded and posted on the Local Foods College website. And we ask you to be patient with the technology. We'll be emailed a link to evaluate the session afterwards, and you can expect about an hour for the session to continue. So tonight we're excited to invite Dr. Sheri Breen from the University of Minnesota Morris. Sheri Breen is an associate professor of political science and affiliated faculty in the Environmental Studies program at the University of Minnesota Morris. As an environmental political theorist, she studies the relationships between human societies and their physical landscapes, focusing on the diverse and conflicting understandings of property and ownership across political systems and cultures. She is currently writing on the historic change from human understandings of food and crop seeds as the source of localized collective wealth to a privatized international system of intellectual property rights over plant genetic resources. So we are excited, Sheri, that you're here with us. And I will pass the ball on to you, and we'll get it started.
Okay. So, hello everybody, and thank you for your patience while we were figuring that out. Now let's see if I can make it up to you with the presentation here. So we're going to focus this session on the question of the ownership of seeds. Who owns the seeds that we save each year from our farms and our gardens? Why do farmers who plant transgenic or GMO seeds need to sign a legal contract that controls their ability to plant those seeds and use their offspring? How do plant breeding programs at universities and corporations lead to private property rights over a variety of seeds? Why does this matter? And what might this have to do with questions of justice? So these might not be questions that you've asked or worried about, but I want to share with you some of the reasons that this topic and these questions are vitally important to how we think about food systems and agriculture. So as a little bit more introduction, I am fascinated by, among other things, the relationships that humans construct among themselves and with their physical and biological landscapes. And to narrow that down a bit more, I'm particularly preoccupied by the concepts of property and ownership with regards to nature, and especially in regards to agriculture. I have a background in agriculture as well as being an associate professor of political science. I've worked in agriculture as a farmhand and other things, and I've covered in ag policy for a long time. So agriculture is a deep interest of mine. So let's talk about why seeds matter, okay? To put it simply, seeds are the essence of life. In all shapes and sizes and distributions, seeds are the genetic powerhouses that store life's codes. They're as essential a resource as the soil and the water that nourish them. But as many of you probably know, the genetic biodiversity of our seeds is at risk. So for a variety of causes, the number of seed varieties in the world has dramatically declined during the past century, and we've lost many of our seeds' genetic ancestors. At the same time, and this is what I'm going to focus on, we're also experiencing a profoundly important historic shift in the way we think about seeds. That is, the way that they are being reconceptualized as intellectual property. Something transformative has been taking shape over the past century or so, and I'm going to tell you a bit about this historic shift and why it matters. So to do this, I'm going to examine two perspectives on seeds and explain the different understandings of justice that are affiliated with these two. But first, to set the stage, I want to tell you two very brief stories about the significance of seeds. The first takes place in the Soviet Union during World War II, and a seed bank called the Vavilov Seed Bank in Leningrad was under siege with the rest of Leningrad by the Nazi armies during this great siege of Leningrad, and people were starving. And within this building, in the seed bank, were seeds that Vavilov and his scientists had collected all over the world. Rare seeds, wild seeds, cultivated seeds, seeds that they had brought back to Leningrad and were storing and preserving and sometimes growing out for future generations. While this siege was going on in Leningrad, as I said, people were starving, and the scientists in the seed bank barricaded the building against, of course, rodents who were trying to eat the seeds, but also against the citizens who were hungry. And during that siege, which lasted quite a while, several scientists starved to death in the same building with these seeds stored. And they explicitly said that they thought their lives were less important than the future of those seeds, because without those seeds, some of those varieties would never be grown again. And so they allowed themselves to starve right next to the seeds that they could have eaten. Another story, this involves the Cherokee Nation, the Western Cherokee, which is based in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And the Cherokee are the second largest nation, Native American sovereign nation in the United States, but also the most widespread. And so every fall, Cherokee come back to Tahlequah for a festival from all over the United States. And one of the key parts of the festival is a giving ceremony in which packets of heritage seeds that have been in the Cherokee gardens for generations are given to each member of the tribe. And a couple of years ago, those seeds started appearing in commercial seed catalogs. They were identified as Cherokee seeds. It wasn't that the commercial catalogs were trying to hide where they were from, but the seeds that they were giving out were spreading far and wide. And in fact, one seed catalog, the owners called the Cherokee Nation headquarters and asked for pure seed stock because the ones that they had gotten a hold of had been crossed and were no longer genetically pure. And this bothered the Cherokee elders quite a bit. On the one hand, the giving ceremony cannot have any conditions on that giving. That's part of what giving is. On the other hand, having those seeds end up in commercial seed catalogs was very unsettling. And so the elders have been working on a new policy and thinking about what limitations, if any, they can put on how those seeds are distributed and used. And this is a paradox for them, because on the one hand, they don't believe that they own those seeds. On the other hand, they really don't want them appearing in commercial catalogs without their participation. So these two stories are an indication, I think, of how profoundly seeds can affect us culturally and in terms of our own life. So I'm going to take you a bit around the world tonight and give you some ideas of how I have done my research on this, what I'm working on, and how I think some of this is important. So first, how is this debate about seeds as privatized intellectual property taking shape at the community level? Let me tell you a little bit about what's going on. There are organizations around the world that are working on the questions of who owns these seeds and what we should be doing with these seeds. These are seed-saving networks and organizations. For example, the photo on the left is from a community group in the Himalayan foothills in India. And this is a village group that meets every week, and they talk about what seeds they are saving, how to save them, how to protect them. And the Gene Campaign, which is the organization they work with, has a seed bank that these women use. So they put seeds into the gene bank, get seeds back out of the gene bank, seed bank, sorry, when they need them. And they also, as this picture shows them doing, they also have bank accounts, and they've started putting money into their savings accounts that they use for farming. And that's what they're doing right there in that photograph. Other such organizations, another one in India. India is actually very active in thinking about seed sovereignty and the ownership of seeds. There's an organization in southern India called the Tamil Nadu Women's Collective that's also working with women farmers in the villages in Tamil Nadu. Another organization in northern India is teaching farmers an age-old form of farming called the 12-seed format, and it's used in the terraces of the Himalayan foothills with a special kind of farming with local seeds so that the farmers do not have to buy their seeds. On the right, you see a photograph of a young man at the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico who is working with seeds, saving seeds, and distributing seeds among Pueblo members to encourage the use of heritage seeds, seeds that they've had from their grandparents and want to continue to use. So these are some of the things that are happening at the community level. Another thing that's happening is seed libraries. These have mushroomed around the United States and Canada in the last 15 years, and you find many local communities that have actual seed libraries at the library. In fact, if you remember those old wooden card catalog drawers, many of them are now containing seed packets, and residents of the community can come in and check out seeds. They may or may not bring seeds back to redeposit, but they are helping distribute seeds at a community level and preventing people from having to either buy them or introducing them to new kinds of seeds and farming on a very local level. So these are some of the things that are happening on the local level. One more example, this is also from India, which is where I've done a fair amount of research. This is from the Tamil Nadu Women's Collective that I mentioned earlier in southern India. At the village level, I saw book after book after book that they had assembled with these drawings. And this is a chart of the village with a designator for how many people are in each family, and especially who has which seeds, who grows what. And it includes both food and crop seeds and also fruit. They were keeping track of fruit bushes and fruit trees as well. So this is a database that they've collected to keep track of who has the seeds, where they are, and if one kind of seed does not grow one year, or a certain kind of fruit bush does not do well one year for various reasons, they know who else has them, and they can keep track of this. And it's an amazing project they've done. No one had ever collected any of this information before. Another project, I should say, that's going on at the community level is the Open Source Seed Initiative. This is based in Madison, Wisconsin, but has been nationwide now for about 3 years. And this is a group that is specifically trying to provide an alternative to the private ownership of seeds and the patenting of seeds. And I'm going to talk more about patenting in a bit. The Open Source Seed Initiative is patterned after the open source software movement, where you can design software and anyone can have access to the coding. It's not private. So here, the Open Source Seed Initiative has certain kinds of seeds that have been donated into this program. And anyone who uses these seeds, buys these seeds, or is given these seeds, has to pledge that they will be able to use the seeds any way they choose, but they cannot confine the freedom of anyone down the road from using the same seed in any way they want. So in other words, the seeds can be commercialized, they can be sold, but they cannot be privatized in a proprietary way. So here's the pledge that's on the seed packets for the Open Source Seed Initiative. It says on each packet, you have the freedom to use these OSSI pledged seeds in any way you choose. In return, you pledge not to restrict others' use of these seeds or their derivatives, any product down the line, by patents or other means, and to include this pledge with any transfer of these seeds or their derivatives. So now let me ask all of you a question. How many of you would be willing to agree to this pledge? Would you agree to give up any possible rights of ownership that could restrict others' ability to modify a seed variety you have developed? Would you sign this pledge? Please check the green check for a yes and the red X for a no. Again, would you sign this pledge saying that you pledge not to restrict anyone else's use of this seed in the future? Most of you are saying yes, but not all. And we're going to look at some of the arguments against this, why some people might not be willing to go along with this. Okay? But in this group, an overwhelming number of you would support this kind of a pledge. So I've been showing you what's been going on at the community level. I want to give you a little bit about what's happening at the national level on this issue. So on the right, you see the cover of a publication from a group called La Via Campesina, which is a peasant group, which is what their name means, that works around the world, but works particularly on the national level to change seed laws. Now, nearly every country has a seed law, and we do too. The United States does too. And those seed laws regulate how seeds can be bought and sold and traded. Ours came, we developed our seed laws during the Depression, actually, and the seed law was designed to help prevent bad seeds from being distributed. It was aimed at the purity of seeds. But countries other than the United States and our own states in the United States have very specific seed laws about how seeds can be bought, traded, sold, given away. And some of these seed laws have been seen by peasant organizations such as La Via Campesina as being very detrimental, as preventing farmers from saving their own seeds and being able to distribute their own seeds. In the United States, some of you may remember just within the last couple of years, the state seed law prevented the Duluth Seed Library from distributing its seeds for a while. They had to shut down while the Minnesota legislature figured out how to handle the state seed law to allow them to operate again. So seed laws that criminalize farmers is something that these groups are working on very hard and protesting very hard. On the left, you see the top part of a Supreme Court ruling, the U.S. Supreme Court. So this activism and this discussion, this issue, takes place in the court not just a policy level, it's also a legal level in the courts. And this is from a 2013 U.S. Supreme Court case of Bowman versus Monsanto. And this was a decision that it verified the corporation's full ownership of the soybean seeds genetic material through multiple generations. It was, it denied the ability of a farmer to continue to plant soybeans that he had gotten from Monsanto in future generations. And so it solidified some questions of legal ownership to seeds to the company that developed those seeds. What is happening at the international level? And I started this project a couple of years ago. I've been working on this, and I started really talking to seed savers a lot and talking to people at the farming level. But increasingly, I've been focusing a great deal more attention at the international level because there's a couple of things going on here that I have come to believe are absolutely crucial and that affect the seed savers and farmers everywhere. So I want to focus here just tonight in our discussion on one specialized agency of the United Nations, and that's the World Intellectual Property Organization. And it has a committee called the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge, and Folklore. And that's what you see in this photograph is a session of this. It's called the WIPO IGC for short, because that's such a long name. And WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, is based in Geneva, Switzerland, and it controls the international regime of intellectual property rights. And in this IGC, in this committee, it is trying to create a new instrument, whether that's a new treaty, some kind of new document, that integrates the ownership of plant genetic resources, or seeds, and traditional knowledge, peasant knowledge, indigenous knowledge about those seeds. So national delegations to this committee are struggling over a period of years to reach consensus, which is necessary at an international level to come up with a new document. It does not work by majority rule. It has to be consensus, and everybody has to agree. All delegations have to agree before the language can be put into this new document. And much work remains to be done before they'll be able to create a document that's capable of achieving wide agreement. So many of the members of this committee that you see here in this photograph during their negotiations, many of the members and indigenous organizations that are sitting in the back as observers are voicing a great many concerns about the forced sharing of information by traditional and local communities. And they worry about inadequate documentation of original sources by those who apply for intellectual property rights. So they feel that on the one hand, they're being forced to give up some of their own traditional knowledge without wanting to, especially regarding what they see as some of the sacred aspects or medicinal aspects of the plants. And secondly, they don't feel like corporations that are doing research on these seeds are documenting where they got them sufficiently. At the same time, in the same room, WIPO is founded on the idea that intellectual property rights protect and promote research and development. That's why intellectual property rights, the ownership of ideas came up. For example, with manuscripts, you write a book, you have intellectual property rights through copyright. You do a new invention, you have ownership through patent law. And the result of these different views is that the document that this group is designing is, it really contains two parallel and irreconcilable tracks that arise from these two different views. Because they have to have consensus and cannot go by majority rule, any language that has not yet achieved consensus is in brackets. And this document is almost entirely brackets. There's very little language in this document that has actually been agreed upon by everyone. So it's in effect brackets that create two really different parallel documents that are not coming together. So unless they can come together in some substantive way on these differences, this is not going to move together. And so the struggles going on in Geneva are deeply tied to very different, divergent conceptual understandings about what seeds are and why they matter, and how these disagreements are tied to different conceptions of justice. So I'm going to show you now that where these distinctions come from. And I believe in my research that we can't address the idea of ownership of seeds without gaining some perspective into, or some understanding, excuse me, of these two perspectives. So I'm going to talk about these two perspectives and their understandings of justice. So perspective one, this is the perspective that sees seeds as a collective source of community wealth. This perspective has a long history for thousands of years. Since the rise of agriculture, seeds have been one of the two most important forms of community wealth. When a community is not able to maintain seeds for the future and for the next growing seasons, and it is not able to maintain children for the next generation, that community is at risk to its core. So in this view, the idea of seeds as an object of property is understood either as collective property, not individual privatized property, or perhaps even viewed as a nonsensical idea. So first, collectively, property rights would be collective in terms of how they're held, who has access, for whose sake they are developed and protected, and that is for the community as a whole, even when individual farmers or families have been particularly active in the selection of those seeds. In addition, property rights over seeds are often viewed as nonsensical in the sense that seeds are living beings and not containers of information. In this way, the seeds are inherently part of a web of complex relationships from which they cannot be logically or ethically separated. So from this perspective, humans and seeds share a goal. We cooperate with them and they with us, but we can never be said to own them. So from this first perspective then, intellectual property rights are regarded either with suspicion or outright hostility. So this perspective instead emphasizes access to seeds, preservation of particular varieties or land races, or often the sacredness of seeds as living entities. So on the screen, you see two different examples of this. Native Seed Search is an organization in southern Arizona that has collected and sells and redistributes heritage seeds and indigenous seeds from the Southwest. And they work with groups such as the Tohono O'odham Nation in Tucson, as you see on the right, which has a thriving farm operation and market garden. And they rely on each other both to find old seeds and preserve them and to redistribute seeds that have been collected to Native American farmers. So as we turn to the second perspective, consider that a critical reflection of this historic transformation is found in our language. So our conceptualization of things, how we think about things in our world, the people, the ideas, the events in our world, they're tied to the words that we use to describe them. You know, language is one of our sharpest political tools, and our perceptions of the world are reflected in the words that we employ. And this is reciprocal, it goes around. Our words change how we view things, and these things change how we use words. And in this case, the historic shift is reflected in the movement from the language of seeds to the language of plant genetic resources. Seeds are physical, dynamic objects that sprout, that grow, that feed us. Seeds are alive, and for some, as I've been saying, are sacred living beings. Plant genetic resources, in contrast, are data containers. that we access, that we take apart, that we record, and that we manipulate. These words are references to the same thing in one sense, but they present them and understand them in very different ways. So what is the second perspective that focuses on plant genetic resources? The second perspective, in contrast to the first, regards these as privatized genetic resources that can be constituted as a form of intellectual property. The philosophical foundations for this perspective goes back to the 17th century English philosopher John Locke and his labor theory of value. In his explanation of how private property originates, how we came to have such a thing as private property, and how private property, once established, is justified, Locke focused on how we create value through human labor. He says when we do something that results in change, when we harvest fruit, when we build a fence, when we create a building, when we write an essay, we are creating new value and thereby creating the right to private property. So it's the investment of human labor that creates something new, that creates value, that creates the right to property. So likewise, plant breeding and plant improvement and biotech innovations and seeds are understood as creations of new value. They are initiating new property rights as the just rewards for innovation. So the core of this second perspective of seeds then is that plant breeding and research on plant genetic resources involve the addition of value in the form of human knowledge, which inherently creates a relationship of property. So in an important sense then, this process, the genetic data that the seed provides becomes more important than the materiality of the seed itself. So gene banks, such as the USDA's National Depository in Fort Collins, Colorado, and here in this photo, you see the liquid nitrogen storage area. These gene banks are guardians of data as much as or even more than they are seed keepers. So as a type of intellectual property, this data can be patented through national and international patent systems and protected by other types of contract law and national seed laws, as I've mentioned before, that confirm the owner's ability to control the use and exclusion and transfer of their property rights to others. So who are the political actors in this perspective? They're the owners of the intellectual property, which is usually either the so-called seed giant corporations or the universities, and those who buy them. It's a reciprocal relationship between buyers and sellers who make an agreement. So now I want to ask you another question. So having heard so far just the summary of these two perspectives, which perspective do you find most familiar, most appealing? So which one, if you had to choose just one, which one would you agree with most strongly? So first, let me ask, yes or no on perspective number one, seeds as a source of community wealth. If you find the first perspective, seeds as a source of community wealth, most appealing, most persuasive, perhaps most familiar, please click on the green check mark. And if you don't, please click on the red X. And I realize I'm forcing you to make, a binary decision here. It's more complex than that, but I want to see which one seems to attract you most, which one seems most convincing. Okay, it's pretty overwhelmingly that those who have voted here vote for the first one. Okay, let's do the second one now. If you had to choose, because it's not necessarily one or the other, let's see how it matches the first vote. Second now, yes or no on perspective number two, seeds as intellectual property. And there might be some of you who are voting yes on both of them. So let's see how it goes. Would you vote yes, the green check mark, or no, the red X, for the second perspective, which sees seeds as intellectual property. Okay, a few people are still deciding. But this one is much more evenly split. So the majority of you, the large majority of you, found the first perspective appealing, persuasive. You've found you could go along with it. And the second one, it's close to being split half and half, a few more for it than against it. Okay? So this is, I think, a measure of how difficult these perspectives are to choose between and to think through. Let's now talk about issues of justice. Okay? So the second perspective, we're dealing with the second one now, the intellectual property perspective. This second perspective leads to a particular understanding of how to define and how to achieve justice. So in this view, starting from the top, the research and development, which are innovative investments of labor, lead to the creation of new value, which in turn leads to property rights, including intellectual property rights, which require protection through law, continuing around the circle, and thus justice involves the direct sharing of benefits through voluntary contracts between individual owners and individual buyers, which then enables future research and development. This kind of protection keeps research and development going. This is the contractual understanding of justice. From this perspective, then, justice requires that innovation be rewarded and protected through property rights that allow the continuation of the cycle of added value and economic and intellectual growth through private contractual agreements. Let's compare this with a conception of justice based on community wealth, the first perspective. So again, starting from the top, we begin with the accumulation of traditional knowledge about seeds that's gained through generations of growing. And so from this perspective, justice regarding seeds has multiple components, such as the recognition and protection of this traditional knowledge of plant breeding and usage. Further on, fair compensation for the use of that knowledge by outsiders. This falls under the term benefit sharing in national and international policy. Keeping going around the circle, then protection of that knowledge from forced sharing, such as international databases that collect information about seeds, about their origins, and their cultural and sacred meanings. And in this sense, then, justice is collective rather than individualistic, and cultural rather than contractual through the maintenance of seeds, again, as community wealth. So I want to take a step back here for a moment and ask a necessary question. What are the problems that need to be solved? Let's think about the dynamics of this issue. So we have two deeply divergent understandings of what seeds are. On the one hand, a turbocharged bundle of life versus a valuable and manipulable data set, and what seeds mean to us, a source of community wealth versus an avenue for privatized innovation and creativity. The first perspective goes back millennia and is rapidly losing political ground. The second perspective came of age only in the 20th century and has become the global leviathan in terms of international trade and international law. So what do we do with this? Well, many see, and this photo here is an example from the National Heirloom Seed Exposition a few years ago. This is an annual event. Many see that the problem is then fighting the multinational corporations such as Monsanto or Dow, and that these are the enemies. And this, in many ways, is, I think, a fairly strong wave going on. There's a great deal of energy against the international gene giants, the international seed companies. So I want to ask one more question. How many of you would agree with this position? that the problem is the existence of and the operation of the multinational corporations such as Monsanto. So again, please choose a check or a red X. And the vote is very strong in its support of this kind of a position, and therefore support for the position against Monsanto, for example. And I'm not surprised by that. This is a very strong movement that's going on, and some very energetic activism that's going on. But I want to bring up some complicating factors here right at the end as I tie this together. Think again about the two different understandings of justice that we just looked at. Both perspectives believe that they are pursuing justice and fighting those who are barriers to justice. Both perspectives believe they're trying to preserve diminishing biodiversity and feed the world's hungry. Both perspectives work from a foundation of theoretical and ethical justifications for their position. And in the interviews I've done and the travels I've done and the much talking to people I've done, it's become pretty clear to me that the peasant activists in Tamil Nadu, India, and the gene bank researchers at Fort Collins, Colorado, and the plant breeding specialists for Monsanto all can be equally committed to their visions of a good world. I do not see this myself as a Manichaean battle between good and evil. I think it's more complex than that. So if there's a problem to be solved, then what is it? I think there are a few problems, as a matter of fact. One is that we have a great deal of hubris and miscommunication at the level of human relationships. At the national and international policy levels, the minimizing of one historic perspective by another with very little attempt to understand its philosophical and cultural roots. There's a surprisingly low level of reciprocal dialogue going on, as I've described at the WIPO IGC, that international agency that I was referring to. A second problem, I believe, is that there's significant harm going on at the political and economic and environmental levels. This transition to a protected system of hybrid and transgenic seeds in the world's farming regions has harmed peasants and farmers in several ways. Third, at the theoretical level, the ideas level, I think there's been a logical misstep, a theoretical fallacy happening of extending intellectual property rights from acts of creativity, such as music and books and mechanical inventions, to seeds, which are living entities, whether we believe they're sacred or not, that have been in a life-sustaining relationship with humans for millennia. So the intellectual regime of intellectual property rights over plant genetic resources, it's relying on what I think is a maneuver of what I call legal physics, this is all based on the argument that plant breeding research, which generates some kind of new identity through the transformation of the original seed, then it creates a property right that is real, not abstract or intangible, but it's real, because the right to that property and the materiality of the seed in itself have merged into a single unit. And so legally, the right is considered to be, in effect, part of the seed. And I think this is a tricky legal maneuver that I can test, that I think is a problem. So these then are the problems that I see going on. So in conclusion, what I've shared with you here is an outline of a historic change that's transforming our political and conceptual understanding of seeds, and a quick overview of some of the associated problems and responses to those seeds. So in the end, I have to say, I believe one of the fundamental principles of our relationship to seeds is encapsulated in that ancestral view that reminds us how much is at stake. Our future is contained within our children and our seeds. So thank you, and I'm eager to hear your questions.
Looks like there's a question that came in.
Mm-hmm.
so I'll read it out loud. And do you think there can be a middle ground where rights expires after a period of time? Have you seen some of this?
We do that with pharmaceuticals and with patents, where we do have, in the US, where we, and it's done elsewhere as well, where the copyright or the patent goes for a certain length of time, and after that it goes into the commons. That is a possibility. I do not see negotiation going on that. I do not see that as being one of the options that's being discussed very much. I do think that would help in some ways. I am open to that idea as a possibility. I don't think it would solve the problems that I was listing, though, at least not sufficiently. The initial period, if patents were held over seeds, still would prevent farmers and gardeners, like many of us and peasant farmers all over the world, from having access to those except for paying at a high price. And that would not alleviate the problem of what happens to the ownership of the, again, the plant genetic resources when those are taken from where they are raised, traditionally the historic grounds of them, and then the genetic material is transformed into some new variety that is patented. That problem of what happens to that genetic material isn't just a matter of how long, it's a matter of losing it from the traditional communities and the indigenous communities. So I think that's worth thinking about, definitely, but I don't think it would be enough by itself. Any more questions? I see the comment that it's a complex topic. Yes, it is. It is, and we hardly think about it. We think of seeds, these seeds they seem so simple. We take them for granted. I mean, a seed, they've been around forever. But, oh, there's so much significance packed into these seeds, including the political significance. So thank you for listening.
There's another question there, too. Where do you think your research will go next?
I'm working on a book project, so I'm trying to, I want to lay this out, and I want to do it both for academic audiences, and that's going to be a series of articles that I've been working on, but I want to I'm writing a book that's aimed at a much broader audience. I think we're not paying attention to this issue, so I both want to call attention to it and help explain what is going on, because it is complex and it's not being noticed very much. And I want to make some policy recommendations. I think there's some serious problems. As I said, one of them is at the negotiation stage. So there's some like at the international level. So I'm developing a series of proposals that I think should be put forward to try to do this. And one of the main things I think needs to be done is much greater awareness and consideration of the seeds as a community wealth perspective. I don't think it's being given its due at all. It's being really marginalized. So that's one of the things I want to really try to help.
A comment. Thank you for your important work.
Mm-hmm.
Teresa.
Yep, and I also see a question about how can human intervention in life processes be anything other than harmful. I have to say, I cannot help remaining an optimist, because one of the reasons is groups like you that gather together to talk about things like this. As long as that keeps happening, I am hopeful. And also in the students that I work with every day, they really care about these issues, and many of them want to farm and want to be involved in food systems. So the people I see every day and talk to every day keep giving me hope. There's a great generation coming up behind me that wants to do this work.
Thank you so much, Sheri, for
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks everyone for tuning in, and again, this will be available recorded online, and have a great night, everyone.
Good night.